Hello all, welcome back to Business Law at Columbia College. My name is Cassandra Jenneke and I'll be your instructor for today, well, for the whole class. So today what we're going to be talking about is the fifth element of a valid and enforceable contract. So as a review, again, you've seen this slide so many times, but you're welcome because it's good for us to review every single element that we've gone over before going to the next. So we know that in order for a contract to be valid and enforceable, it must be comprised of an agreement, which is based on a valid offer and a valid acceptance of that offer. That agreement must be between two or more competent parties based on those parties' genuine assent into the contract, supported by consideration, so a bargain for exchange between the parties. And the fifth element, which we'll be talking about today, is that the contract must be for a lawful objective. What do I mean by lawful objective? Let's talk about it. So, a contract is illegal or unlawful, right? In two ways. One, the performance or formation of the contract constitutes a crime or a tort. Recall that we talked about the differences between crimes and a tort. Crimes are violations of the law where the victim is the government versus a tort where it's a violation of the law and a victim is a person, okay? Or the agreement is illegal because it is so contrary to public policy or it's unconscionable that a court will look at it and be like, well, it's not illegal, but boy is it messy and ugly and immoral, unconscionable. We're going to find that it violates public policy and therefore cannot be enforceable as a contract. Let's delve a little bit deeper. So what happens to your contract if it's illegal, right? If the fifth element, not for a lawful objective, is missing. Okay, so if an agreement is illegal, so it constitutes either a crime or a tort, your contract is void. There is no remedy for failure to perform. There's no remedy for any detriment that you suffer as a result of the agreement happening. It is void, non-existent. Some contracts can appear legal, okay, but they may be unenforceable if they were entered into for illegal purposes. So one of my favorite examples here are escort services, right? So you're entering into what appears to be not an illegal contract, right? You're just taking another person out for companionship and you're just paying for the pleasure of doing that through some service. But the real reason you're doing it is because you know that this escort service allows people to have sex with their escorts. So the purpose is illegal because it's for prostitution. Now we can talk all day long about whether or not sex work should be legalized, whether it should be regulated. That's a whole other class. But my example is just to show you that even if it looks like a legal contract, right? It's not for an illegal purpose on the written word of it. If it's illegal in practice and on purpose, then it's illegal. So, are there any exceptions to that effect, that void, unenforceable end to your illegal contract? Of course there are, because it's the law. Okay, there's always an exception, and if there isn't an exception, that's because the rule already contains an exception, right? So if the court looks at the contract and says, okay, the law that it violates is intended to protect one of the parties, then that party that was supposed to be protected by the law that was violated can seek relief. So a good example is if you enter into a contract with a lawyer who's not a real lawyer, okay? Illegal, because a person who isn't admitted to the state bar is not allowed to practice law. So it's an illegal contract. But the person that was supposed to be protected by that contract is the client. And so if the client is like, oh my God, this isn't a real lawyer, I'm in an illegal contract, I need my money back, that person, the client, because that is the person who was supposed to be protected by the law that was violated, gets to be the person who gets their money back, okay? In that same scenario, the lawyer, with my quotation marks, lawyer, that person doesn't get to sue the client for failure to pay, right? Because it's an illegal contract for something that you're not allowed to do. Also, if there is an unequal guilt between the parties, let's say you have a really sophisticated person and a really unsophisticated person legally, right? Typically speaking, the more sophisticated party is going to be the more guilty party because they should have known or did know better and chose to do it anyway, versus the unsophisticated party that didn't know, wasn't ever going to know. So if it's in the public interest to enforce some portion of that contract or to allow for damages as a result of a breach of that contract, then based on in pari delicto, which is unequal guilt, the court may grant relief. But again, you don't ever want to be going into a situation where the answer is only may grant relief, right? So I think we're on rule like number 4. Don't enter into an illegal contract. Don't enter into a contract with a minor. Always write it down. And always write it down. Okay. Now, you may have a contract that's large, that has a multitude of promises, benefits, and detriments, a whole lot of back and forth going on, some of which within that one contract may not intermix with another part of that contract. Okay, perfect. Court looks at the contract and says, hey, listen, this phrase, this section, this clause right here, that's illegal. But the rest of it is okay. What the court oftentimes will do, again, because they want to enforce your contracts, okay, they'll just remove, excise, pull out the illegal part and leave the rest of the legal sections in the contract valid and enforceable. Contracts for crimes and torts are always void. So you don't get to hire somebody to beat somebody else up, to murder your husband. You don't get to do that. You don't get to hire somebody to infringe on a contract, okay? The tort of intentional contract interference, okay? Don't get to do that. Those are void. Always and forever. Void, 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 okay? Now, there's this concept in the law specific to contract performance, and it's called good faith and fairness. Good faith and fair dealing. It is an implied obligation in every single contract that's entered into in every state, anywhere in the United States. And that's basically that neither party will do anything to destroy the contract or to so injure the other party that they can't perform the contract, right? So you can't sabotage your own contract and you can't sabotage somebody else in the performance of your contract. Make sense? Good faith and fair dealing. That is a clause that we put into contracts specifically because we, again, freedom of contract, right, want people to perform their contracts. And so they need to know that if they do something to undermine the contract, it's going to be on them. Now, when I talked to you about consideration, I already mentioned the concept of courts not really caring about whether or not you entered into a bad deal, right? They don't. Freedom of contract, people get to enter into shitty contracts every day, every single day. And they do, in fact, everywhere, okay? Courts don't care about fairness in contract disputes. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about letter of the law, who breached, who did something wrong, and who has to pay. But again, right, it's the law, and so we don't like black and white rules. okay? And so sometimes a court will look at a contract and say to itself, holy moly, it is so harsh. It is so oppressive to one of the parties that's in the contract that the court just can't bring itself to enforce performance, right? Or to find that that oppressed, harshly treated party should have to pay anything. What is unconscionability? Well, unconscionability has a couple of different meanings and courts apply it kind of differently, but when you break it down generally, unconscionability is something, again, that is so harsh that demonstrates that one party had such an offensive advantage over the other that the court just has to take a step back and say, man, I can't enforce this contract because it is unconscionable, right? It shocks the conscience. Okay. So there can be two different types of unconscionability. There can be unconscionability in the procedure, okay, in the formation of the contract, versus substantive unconscionability, which is really in the terms and in the performance of the contract. So when we talk about procedural, that's really one that I think is really easy for people to envision. So think about your, some genius app developer who's just coming up. You're 19, you're really smart, but you're still in college, you're living at your parents' house, developing apps out of your garage, okay? And Apple comes knocking, dunk, 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 right? They're like, hey, listen, we really want your app. We're willing to give you 80 grand for it right now. Listen, you can't get a lawyer. We don't have time for you to have a lawyer. We need you to come to Apple right now. Let's get to Cupertino. You get into the room, and you're in a room full of 50 Apple lawyers, and it's just you. And you're like, and they're schmoozing you, and they're telling you, oh my God, $80,000 is such a great deal for that app. We're giving you double what it's worth in the market right now. It's so great. I don't know about you, 80 grand in my pocket sounds awesome. So you take it, okay? You take it. Then come to find out, Apple makes, I don't know, $800 million off of your app. Or take it lower, $8 million off of your app that they paid you $80,000 for. I don't know about you, but 19-year-old me would be really, really upset by that. And I might try to sue Apple to invalidate our contract because it is so shocking that you told me its fair market value was only $80,000 and that's what you paid me. And then you make all that money off of it, right? So break that scenario down. Let's talk about pre-agreement. How unconscionable does it seem for this young, unsophisticated kid to be pitted against 50 super savvy, intelligent lawyers representing a behemoth company, right? Apple has way too great of an advantage over this one little 19-year-old, right? So procedurally, that is a really unconscionable feeling. It's the difference between the parties and their legal sophistication is so great that a court may look at that and say, oh yeah, that kid, no, we're not going to enforce that contract. Apple, you should have known better. Apple, you should have told him to get a lawyer. You should have told him to talk to 10 lawyers because otherwise this is an unconscionable deal. And you should have known that because you were legally sophisticated. So let's say a court looks at that and is, okay, you know what? Everybody gets to enter into stupid contracts every day. But then let's look at the substantive side of it. Let's look at the terms. He gives over an app. He gets $80,000 for it. Apple makes $800 million off of it. They figure out something out of the software that revolutionizes the industry. I don't know. That is so shocking to the conscience, right? This kid was sitting on this incredible Apple mine that Apple just took out from under him. Does that seem substantively, in the way that the contract is being performed, unfair? Yeah, it does. It might. right? And so that might be how a court determines if something is unconscionable, okay? So contracts of adhesion are a good example of procedural unconscionability. They're basically take it or leave it contracts. But we know from when we talked about economic duress that courts, I already did it. Sorry, that was my mom. Dog was trying to get second dinner. Rude. Contracts of adhesion are situations where they're take it or leave it. But as we talked about in economic duress situations, courts recognize that you can always walk away, right? You never have to, never, strong word, almost never have to enter into a contract that you don't want to. So, sounds like a personal problem if you enter into a contract that was take it or leave it, and you might have gotten screwed out of the deal, okay? Now, arbitration. I would hazard a guess that in any number of terms of use and agreement that you have entered into for any number of softwares that are on your phone, that are on your computers, probably even taking out your student loans, every single one of them has a mandatory binding arbitration clause. Here's the shake, right? We talked about this a little bit when we talked about alternative dispute resolution, but the reality is that our court systems do not have time to hear every single case where there is a dispute. They simply don't. And so SCOTUS, which is the Supreme Court of the United States, you're welcome, has said repeatedly that arbitration clauses, binding or otherwise, are preferred and will be enforced absent some unconscionable term. So in the late 80s, Sharp, which I don't know if any of you remember that brand, it's my first TV that I bought myself was a Sharp. But Sharp was selling goods on the American markets as a Japanese company. And so what they did was they had in all of their purchasing agreements for their products a binding arbitration clause. So when you bought a Sharp TV, you had to arbitrate if there was anything wrong with it, product defects, things of that nature. And guess where you had to arbitrate? Japan, y'all. You had to arbitrate in Japan. How mind-boggling is that? Let me tell you, me in the 80s, number one, I was an infant. But number two, nobody in their right mind was going to Japan to argue with Sharp about a TV. Okay? Not one person. And so somebody who was upset about that clause sued them and took it all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And basically what the Supreme Court says was like, hey, listen, that is an unconscionable requirement, Sharp. You cannot operate in the United States, have factories here, have primary places of business here, and require that people in the United States arbitrate in Japan. You can require someone who lives in Louisiana to arbitrate in California, where you have a primary place of business. That's fine, because it's within the continental United States. But otherwise, no, 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 no. That is not a valid and enforceable arbitration requirement. So, again, when we think about what's unconscionable, it has to be pretty damn obvious. It has to, again, shock your conscience in order for you to say, ooh, we shouldn't enforce that because it's unconscionable. So similar with illegality, if a contract is unconscionable, the court can excise out the parts that are unconscionable, or if the unconscionability permeates the entire contract, they can just refuse to enforce your contract at all, okay, and it'll be void. Now, this is one of the places where contract law meets public policy, okay? Because when we talk about agreements that affect public welfare, harken all the way back, right, to our first week in class where we talked about the police power, right? There are some agreements that are so offensive to society that while they may not violate the law, courts will find that the agreement and the performance called for by that agreement is so contrary to public policy that those contracts are voidable. Okay? So again, courts don't intervene until you bring a case before them. If a contract is voidable, it won't be deemed unenforceable unless or until somebody complains about it and asks for the contract to be voided. What in the world does contrary to public policy mean? I mean, that's a valid question. Public policy goes like this, right? It just changes. My hand's going up and down like a sine wave curve. It's crazy. So when we think about, first of all, what is public policy, right? Public policy is put into place to protect us, the public, right? Society, from the things that will be harmful to us, okay? Or that are harmful to something that we have established as an interest of our society, something that we need to protect, something that we need to have. Okay. Here's some examples of agreements that are illegal because they violate public policy and public welfare. Let's walk through them, shall we? So gambling contracts, those are illegal. So unless you are in the state of Nevada, the state of New Jersey, on an Indian reservation, or in a place that allows gambling, gambling is illegal. And let's think about why, right? Because I always think, well, yeah, you could remember that gambling contracts are illegal, but remember why. Think about Western movies, right? There's inevitably a bar with people gambling in the background. And almost inevitably, somebody gets pissed that somebody else was cheating and they're all drunk and then they get mad and they're hot because there's no air conditioning and they shoot each other in the middle of the bar, right? Gambling is dangerous. Gambling appeals to humanity's most basic instincts, right? I want more than somebody else has, right? And so we make gambling contracts illegal because we want to protect, a little bit of paternalism there for you, protect our people from making mistakes. Okay. I would also hazard a guess and offer for you, given the states that do have legal gambling, that the whole making gambling illegal is purposed with attempting to eliminate a black market, right? So it also gets into that. It gets into, bootleg liquor in the 20s. It gets into illegal narcotics, right? It permeates that. And so gambling contracts are illegal. Private lotteries are also illegal. What is a private lottery? Well, a lottery is something that has a price, okay? So you have to pay money to enter into the lottery. It is a game based on chance alone, okay? And there's consideration underneath that, right? And so you are paying, benefit detriment, right, for the opportunity, the chance, to win money, okay? Now, California has public lotteries, okay? Totally legal. But if you're not the state of California, the Lottery Commission, you don't get to have a lottery, okay? Raffles are lotteries, okay? Yeah, totally are, because you're paying for a chance to get something, okay? If they are for a charitable purpose, like you go to an auction and you buy raffle tickets, and like I do this at the Canine Fundraiser for the Sheriff's Office all the time, right? I buy $20 worth of tickets and hope that I'm gonna win a picture or a bottle of liquor or a firearm, like any of those things, anything in between. Charitable purpose though, because the proceeds all go towards the Sheriff's Canine Fund. Perfect. Charitable purpose raffles, okay. But again, have to show that it's for a charity. You can't just have one, okay? So there are also giveaways, right? We all, like, who doesn't love something free, right? Well, games like that, giveaways are lawful so long as you don't have to pay to participate. So if they're doing a giveaway at a brand new store that's opened, and they're going to give something to the first or to the 25th person that walks in the door, that's totally okay because you don't have to pay anything to participate in that giveaway. Make sense? Public lotteries, as I mentioned, are legal, okay? And an activity is not gambling when the result is based on skill and skill alone. We're going to talk about that in your next discussion for next week about DraftKings. Can't wait. Now, another way that we as society try to protect the public, okay, through public policy, is through regulation of business activity, regulation of business practices, and licensing. So if a contract violates a business regulation, it's typically going to be void if the public policy behind the regulation is based on some perceived danger to the public. So certain classes of contracts can be regulated based on statute, and California, as I've mentioned before, is a special flower and likes to regulate just about everything. You have to comply with that regulation or you risk that contract being voidable if someone sues you, right? So depending on how good the lobby is, fact, unfair but fact, you run the risk of a contract being voidable if you screw up a regulation, okay, or compliance with a regulation. Licensing. So I kind of already gave you an example when I talked about lawyers, but I think licensing is particularly easy for us to understand when we think about contractors, okay? Contractors have to pass a skills-based test, right? It's a paper test, I think, but it's a skills-based test to make sure that a licensed contractor knows all of the things that they need to know in order to make people safe in their contracting projects. Awesome. Super easy to identify public welfare purpose, right? Here's the deal. In the state of California, if you, an unlicensed contractor, engage in a contract with a client for contracting work and something goes wrong, you are on the hook for it. It is a strict liability basis for liability, okay? If you screw up something at somebody's house, you're on the hook for it. If they don't pay you, you don't get to sue them because they didn't pay you. The state, the court, is going to hold it against you every single time because you are the one operating unlicensed, and your client, whether they know or don't know, is the person that that law was supposed to protect. Therefore, go all the way back to illegality, right? Would be an illegal contract because you shouldn't enter into a contract with an unlicensed contractor, but there's unequal guilt and one party was supposed to be protected, and so you are screwed. Now, there is this concept of quantum meruit, which I think that we've talked about already, but if we haven't, quantum meruit, quickly, is the concept that you get as much as you gave, right? Or as you deserve. Makes sense. So, in some states, again, not California, but in some states, what will happen is you enter into a contract with an unlicensed contractor. They do some work on your house, but not all of it because something goes wrong or you stop paying them. The court may look at a situation and say, hey, listen, yeah, they don't get the full amount of the contract because, hey, they're not licensed, but you, homeowner, have to pay them for the work that they did do. Okay, makes sense, makes sense. We typically do not like contracts that restrain trade. So this, I mean, take it all the way back to when we talked about the Constitution, right? Interstate Commerce Clause, we do not like things that impact commerce. They're generally going to be illegal because they are contrary to public policy. So good example, monopolies, okay? Nobody in the United States likes a monopoly unless it's cable. Okay. So don't create a monopoly. Those are typically illegal. Price gouging or price setting, again, not illegal unless, nope, even if you're Verizon, it doesn't matter. So look for those types of, because even though we say we don't like restraints of trade, they kind of happen. One area for you guys to really focus and pay attention to, because you will have an essay question on this point, are non-compete agreements. So a good example of restraints on trade, restraints on business, are agreements to not compete. Example, let's say you are a barber. I had a student once who was a barber, and he was very skilled, and he worked for a barber shop in Twainhart. And they told him, or he was like, hey, listen, I'm giving my notice. I'm going to go work in Sonora. When he became a barber at that shop, he signed an employment contract that barred him from being a barber in Tuolumne County for 2 years after he quit in Twainhart. So he stayed because he didn't want to drive to frickin' Oakdale or Angels to do barbershop work, right? So that's an example of a non-compete clause. The business said, hey, listen, yeah, that's fine. You can leave. But by the way, you can't practice here in Tuolumne County. Bye. It's a restraint on that person's ability to work. And it's a restraint on trade because it restrains the county of Tuolumne from having another barber. Okay. So these are typically going to be disfavored. We don't like them because they restrain trade. They prevent people from spreading their wings, and the reality is that it creates a monopolized workforce. If you want a non-compete clause to be enforceable, which, you know, in certain circumstances is totally warranted. If you're working on really intense, super secretive, highly developing areas, I can totally understand why your employer would want you to not go work for a competitor for at least 2 years, because in 2 years, your knowledge is obsolete, right? So if you want a non-compete clause to be enforceable, you have to hit these following elements. 1, it has to be narrowly drawn to protect the seller or the employer's legitimate business interests. So if you're looking at an essay question and it's talking about, I don't know, a professor, like it's talking about me. Columbia College has a my employment contract that I can't go work for another university in the state of California for 2 years after I quit, let's say. You have to evaluate whether or not Columbia College has a legitimate reason, a legitimate business interest in preventing me from working in the state of California. So you'd have to evaluate that. Next one. It's not unduly burdensome on my ability to learn. Well, I gotta tell you, I mean, it may only be a 4 or 5 hour trip to the state of Nevada, but I'm not driving that 2 times every week to work as a teacher. It's not happening. Okay? So does that unduly burden me? Absolutely, because the geographic, third element, restriction is way broad, and 2 years, that's 2 whole school years. I lose a lot in 2 years, right? And I lose a lot because you're also trying to make me drive to Nevada or Washington, which I'm also not doing. It's a longer drive. So when you evaluate a non-compete clause, you need to tell me whether or not there's a legitimate business interest, whether or not it unduly burdens the employee's ability to learn by having too broad a geographic restriction and by not providing a reasonable time limitation. If it hits all those elements and they're there, that's a valid and enforceable agreement not to compete. Totally valid. But if one of those things is missing, multiple things of those are missing, not enforceable, not valid. So it used to be that historically we would not allow non-compete agreements in the sale of businesses. So, you know, I have a friend here in town who sold his plumbing business several years ago and went to work as the head of plumbing for the casino. Black Oak, not Chicken Ranch. And he sold his business and allowed them to continue to use his business's name, which is fine. But in the sale of that business, there was a prohibition on him opening a competitive plumbing business, right? And so historically, that would have been a void term. He would have been able, let's say, work that scenario out. They're operating his plumbing business. He doesn't like Black Oak. He leaves. He's like, you know what? I'm going to start another business. So I'm going to be, I don't know, John Doe #2 plumbing. Okay. A court would look at that scenario because John Doe 1 plumbing is like, hey, he violated our contract. He's in breach. Make him shut that shit down. Historically, a court would look at that and say, nah, man, no, we don't like that, because what you're doing is you are preventing and restricting trade. You are creating a possible monopoly for your own benefit, and we're not going to have any of that. No, we're not going to have any of that. Now, in the present, the question for non-compete clauses as it relates to the sale of businesses really boils down to one question, and that's if the restriction is necessary to protect the selling party. Selling party, not the purchasing party, the selling party. Because, listen, you're buying a business. You have to assume, for the sake of discussion and the sake of your future, that you're going to have competition. Too bad, so sad if it's the person that you bought your building from. Too bad, so sad if it's the person that you bought your business from. Doesn't matter. A great example is a gentleman in town who opened the Diamondback, sold it, opened Standard Pour, sold it, and is now again operating another restaurant-like business in downtown Sonora. Listen, it doesn't matter, Diamondback. It doesn't matter, Standard Pour. You don't get to be upset with him for doing that because you are in the business of having a competitor. But if it was for his benefit, it would be something different. Something to think about. Employment contracts, those are going to be, not to compete clauses are going to be valid in your employment contract for the same reasons that we've already gone over. If a court finds that it's invalid, okay, that the non-compete clause is invalid, the court will either revise the agreement so that it is reasonable, right? So in my example of my employment, it may say, hey, it's only for 2 months and you can't teach at another school in Tuolumne County. Or you can't teach or you can't teach at a university within Tuolumne County or any of its contiguous, so touching, contiguous counties. More reasonable geographically, more reason in terms of time restriction? Absolutely. Okay. The last kind of illegal contract that we'll talk about are usuries. So an area where states found that industry was taking advantage of the common person was in the payday loan arena. So I don't know if any of you have ever had the unfortunate necessity to participate in a payday loan, but they're pretty predatory. And so what was happening is that people were taking out payday loans, right? Taking out loans against future paychecks, but with interest rates that were crazy, that were like 250% due within 3 days of paycheck. Like the interest rates were crazy. And so now what the states have done is regulated the amount of interest that you can charge for that type of loan. So payday loans are limited to, I think, 100% interest plus something like 12%, which still seems outrageous, right? But in theory, that's how the payday loan company makes their money, because if you pay it back the way that you're supposed to, most people don't, but if you do, they're getting the 12%, right? So a usury is committed when a lender lends money at an interest rate that's higher than the law allows. So like, let's say you went to some backwards black market payday loan shark, right, who charged 150% plus 80% interest. That's an unenforceable contract because it's a usury. Okay, so that is the end of our 6th class, killing it. 5th, 7th class? We're moving right along. Next time we will talk about the last element of a valid and enforceable contract, and then we'll start prepping for your next quiz. If you have any questions, talk to me in your labs. Otherwise, I'll see you later.